What I want to talk to you today about is the scenic wonders of Alberta. And I've set this up by making it a story of unbridled power, a story of drama, a story of glaciers and volcanoes long past, and a story of when banks fail. So we'll start out by looking at some of the scenic wonders, the stunning scenery across Alberta. In the background, there's Pine Ridge Lookout, just going into Waterton Lakes National Park. You go into the east central prairies, and there's mud buttes, these ridges that were thrust by the glaciers when they crossed central Alberta. You go to Police Outpost Provincial Park and look across the border, 6 or 7 kilometers to the south, and there is spectacular Chief Mountain. Writing on Stone Provincial Park, Ice and Iping National Historic Site. It's just beautiful. You've got glacial meltwater channels, misfit streams, volcanic rocks, and an old and ancient shoreline. Dinosaur Provincial Park, which everybody knows about, but not necessarily has everyone been there. The hoodoos and the river deposits and the dinosaurs at this park. Very few people have been to Sulphur Gates Provincial Recreation Area, and it is just stunning in the foothills near Grand Cache. Vimy Peak, Waterton Lakes, just again, spectacular scenery that we've got in our doorstep, in our backyard. Milk River Canyon to the southeast of Lethbridge, south of Medicine Hat. I think Milk River Canyon could be one of the most spectacular vistas we've got in this province. It may rival with the Icefields Parkway in my mind. The author, Aretha Van Herk, wrote for my book, "Visible Alberta is stunningly beautiful, but the poetry of geology is its secret language, a transcendent stratigraphy." Stratigraphy, what's that? That's just layers in the rock. And so if you go to Dry Island, Buffalo Jump, you can see the layers in the rock. You can see those pastel colors all through there. The blacks are coals. Go to Red Rock Coulee in southeastern Alberta, south of Medicine Hat, northwest of the Cypress Hills. And it looks like a moonscape there. Just phenomenal terrain. That's the type of stuff that I cover in the book. The Scenic Geology of Alberta, a roadside touring and hiking guide. And in the book, I take people to various spots all across the province. Yes, I'm a geologist, I'm a professional geologist, but I've tried to write it so that everybody can understand what's in there. I want my colleagues to have bought the book, but it's written for the traveling public of Alberta. I was lucky enough to have 2 artists put their works, put their landscape art into the book. Brent Laycock, he does a lot of work on the Rocky Mountains and in the plains out in front, in the foothills. He put 8 of his paintings into the book. Lucy Carriou did numerous watercolors. She put 8 watercolors into the book. And I was just so pleased that that they agreed to do that. So that gives us a chance for us to see the landscape through the eyes of a geologist, through the eyes of a scientist like myself, as well as through the eyes of an artist. 2 different visions of the same place. So put on your hiking boots, fill your car with gas. It's time to explore and learn how Alberta's most scenic sites were created. We're going to start with the Scenic Geology of Alberta is all about unbridled power. We're going to start by going to Waterton Lakes National Park for that. And this vista that you're seeing here is from the Bison Paddock Lookout. And what you see are these immense mountains which have been moved into place here. You see glacial deposits in front of them and eroded Rocky Mountain foothills. Just spectacular terrain. But before we talk about the power that made it be, let's look at some of the rocks and a little bit about the rocks at Waterton Lakes National Park. They are 1.5 billion years old. That's billion with a B. At the time, North America or the Waterton area would have been situated south of the equator. It was a hot and harsh environment. It wasn't a very nice place to have been. It would have been a very nice place to have been 1.5 billion years ago. In the park and throughout the park, you'll find accumulations of rocks that look like this. They are accumulations of algae. And at that time, algae ruled the world. There were some bacteria around, but Algae was everywhere in the seas and in the oceans. There was no living life. There was no life on land at all. So I say algae ruled the world. And the algae lived in colonies. And you can see these cabbage-shaped or Brussels sprout-shaped colonies that are growing up in this direction. Algae is slimy. It's kind of got a mucus sheath, if you will, and sand and silt will accumulate on that. And then the algae will get on that sand and silt layer, and it just builds up vertically. Another picture of that is in this particular rock. If you walk along the lakes and the streams, you quite often find rocks like this. If you go and look at some of the exposures on some of your hikes, you'll see rocks like this. Here's a bigger one on your left. Here is this algae accumulation called a stromatolite that's 1.5 billion years old. Well, what do they look like today? If you go to Shark Bay in Australia, it is so hot that there's so much evaporation, it became a very salty bay. Nothing lives here except the algae pretty well. In most environments today, snails gastropods eat algae. If this wasn't such a stressful environment, there would be a lot of algae, gastropods, snails through here, and they'd have eaten all this algae. So there is an example from the modern day on your right of what would have lived in the Waterton Lakes National Park area 1.5 billion years ago. If you go look at Cameron Falls within the park, and I could have put a slide of a picture of Cameron Falls, but Brent has drawn it, Morning Sun in Cameron Falls. All through the rocks here are algae accumulations, those stromatolites. So let's talk about that unbridled power that I teased you with. Here is a Google Earth image, Waterton Lakes here, Crow's Nest Pass, Calgary in the distance, Banff in the far distance in the center. And you can see the mountains that create Waterton Lakes National Park. They form a massive rocks that are 140 kilometers north-south, 40 kilometers east-west. They're 7 kilometers thick, thickening to the west. They were buried probably 10 kilometers. And then they were pushed 140 kilometers to their current position. And it's something like that. There is that mass of rocks that has been pushed and shoved 140 kilometers to the northeast. That took place, that movement of the rocks of the mountains took place probably 165 to 60 million years ago. The mountains would have moved at the same rate that your fingernails would move, or your hair grows, centimeters per year. And they were buried deeply. And then once they got to this area, the mountains, the landscape started to erode, and there was 10 kilometers of erosion of material that was taken away from the tops of the mountains to give you this spectacular landscape that you see in Waterton today. That's not to say that the mountains were 10 kilometers higher. Rather, 10 kilometers of material was eroded, and then like an ice cube or an iceberg in the ocean, as the iceberg melts, it lifts up. Same thing happens when these mountains erode. And it's that reason that we have this spectacular landscape. So maybe you remember from this part of the talk, you're dealing with sediments that were 1.5 billion years old, algae ruled, stromatolites, those cabbage-shaped features. There was 140 kilometers of movement to bring the mountains to where they are now, and then the tops were eroded, 10 kilometers of material to be eroded. That's power. Just think of the forces involved to do all of that. Take a look at this Google Earth image again, and the next 2 slides are going to be from right here. And this is from the Waterton River Valley viewpoint, looking north into the Waterton River Valley. And you can imagine that thrust sheet moving at centimeters per year so that these mountains took the position that they are now. And then there was the erosion. Go around the corner. And what do you see? You see the front end of those mountains. This is in the bison paddock. And it's just beautiful, beautiful scenery. A vertical wall would have moved straight towards you. But remember, it was buried deep at the time. And we've got this terrain in front of you, irregular, rugged terrain, glacial deposits and eroded Rocky Mountain foothills. More unbridled power. Let's go to Mount Blakiston on the way to Red Rock Canyon. And what you have here is a dark layer in the bottom of the photograph. It's a dark layer, and on either side of it is a white layer. This dark layer is magma. It's a sill. It's injected magma that was forced into the rocks about 1.47 billion years ago. It would have flowed. That molten rock would have been like water at 1,000 degrees centigrade. It was injected, and it was so hot that it turned these sediments, the limestones, the carbonates, into marble. And that's why you get the triplet: white rock, dark rock, white rock again. This is what a cartoon of what would have happened. These were the sediments that were deposited there. There was magma coming up from the earth, from deep within the earth, and it injected into this sill. Some of that magma went to the seafloor at the time, and some of the rocks that came from that cooling magma are beautiful. If the rocks in the center, the rocks in the center cooled much slower than the rocks on the end, and you had these feldspars being formed. They look like flowers. And you'll see those in several of the buildings within town. On the edge of that sill, on the edge of that magma, the rocks cooled a lot quicker, and the feldspars didn't have a chance to form. Some of the magma went to the surface and flowed out into the ocean, onto the seafloor. There was a pressure difference, and air bubbles formed within the magma. And you can see those 1.47 billion year old air bubbles preserved today. There's Brent's rendition of Mount Blakiston for you to enjoy. Mount Blakiston Summer. Let's go to Red Rock Coulee, south of Medicine Hat, and take a look at it. It looks like a moonscape, and it's known for these large boulders. They're up to 5 meters across. They're circular, they're oval in shape. They're made out of a rock called calcite. They all seem to come from one layer. There's this is marine rocks from a shallow sea, muds from a shallow sea that occupied Western Canada 75 million years ago. There was a volcanic eruption, and volcanic ash was deposited in that ocean. And these rocks, these concretions as they're called, all seem to form on that horizon. There is that ash layer, that volcanic ash layer, and none of these rocks occur above that ash layer. They're all below. These two are in place. They haven't started to move. In the Badlands, erosion occurs at a rate of almost 0.5 centimeter per year. When you get an intense thunderstorm, it just erodes the tops and the sides of these gullies and the valleys. And as a result, they recede millimeters to 0.5 centimeter per year. As a result, then, these concretions start to work their way down. You can see that they're lying on the surface. They're just creeping down slope, eventually making their way into the gullies, the deepest gullies. Why are they there? Here's another picture of those concretions on the moonscape at Red Rock Coulee. Well, at the time, 75 million years ago, Western Canada, much of Western Canada, was opened by a shallow sea. We call it the Bear Paw Sea, but the name doesn't matter. And these are marine muds from that sea. The water depth of the sea was a few meters to a few tens of meters deep, and the concretions formed by chemical processes of rotting organisms just below the seafloor. When you go look at some of the concretions, you can see worm burrows that were crawling in the sand on the seafloor or just below the seafloor at the time. You can see little features called ripples. When the waves come on the seafloor, they oscillate, and you can see preserved ripples. You can see bivalves, clamshells. If you see some of these broken concretions and you look very carefully, you can see growth rings, concentric growth rings, as the concretion grew out below the seafloor. Now, that's got nothing to do with power, intense power. For the intense power that we want to talk about here, about 15 kilometers from here at Bull's Head Butte, a fossil was recovered of prognathodon. And Prognathodon, he had the unbridled power. It was about 10 meters in size. It was bigger than an orca, but like an orca, it was at the top of the food chain. It ate what it wanted and when it wanted. That's the unbridled power I wove in here. And here's Lucy's rendition of Red Rock Coulee. Lucy Carreau, who did the watercolors. The Scenic Geology of Alberta is about drama. So for that, we're going to start by going to Writing on Stone Provincial Park, Icenipe National Historic Site. And it's just a beautiful place to visit. And we'll talk a little bit about it now. There is all the hoodoos. This is a meltwater channel from a large glacial lake, proglacial lake. When it drained, it cut this deep valley. And then the Milk River later occupied that channel. There's volcanic rocks back in the distance of the Sweetgrass Hills. A lot to be seen here. There are hoodoos there. And these lots and lots of hoodoos. And the hoodoos form because of different types of cement that bind the rocks. This is a calcite cemented rock. It's resistant or more resistant to erosion. Below it, there isn't as much of that cement binding the sand grains, and strong winds, strong rain will erode this sand grain by grain to give you these fantastic shapes that you see there. There's also rattlesnakes, just to keep you on your toes. So again, another picture of Milk River there. And what's the geology all about? Well, at river level, there are muds deposited. They were deposited about 84 million years ago. They're not the same muds that we saw at Red Rock Coulee, but they're from a marine seaway. Then there's sands. The cliffs are all 30 meters of sand, 20 meters of sand. That was an ancient shoreline. Above that is coal and old river channels. The pictographs, the carvings in stone, are usually in the lower part of the sandstones. So what did this look like? Forget that column on the right. What did it look like? How can you picture it? This is what Western Canada looked like about 84, 85 million years ago. There was another shallow seaway to the north. There was a shoreline that was advancing in a northerly direction. Writing on Stone Provincial Park probably looked like this. Ocean, sea on this side, and an estuary or bay on this side. You could have surfed on the waves breaking here. You could have swam in these waters in through here. You could have taken your paddleboard into the bay and into the inlet, just to give you a picture of what Western Canada looked like at the time. Let's go for a little hike. Let's go down the cliffs, take one of these paths down the hoodoos, and we're going to look at some of the rock art that is there. This is one of the battle scenes, and it's a post-contact battle. It's dated as post-contact after the Europeans came to North America and horses and muskets made their way north into Montana and Alberta. That would have occurred sometimes in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So what we see here is a scene. There is a Blackfoot camp here. There is a defense line of muskets. There are musket balls coming out of the front of the muskets. There are horses here, so we know it's post-contact. The guns tell us the same thing. On this side is an advancing war party of about 300 warriors. It's a combined war party of the Gros Ventre, the Crow, and the Plains Cree. And there was a battle here. It was referred to or called Retreats Up the Hill Battle, likely took place in 1866, as related by one of the Piikani elders named Bird Rattle. And the outcome of this was that the Blackfoot won this skirmish against this much larger war party. This is about 3 meters across, and it's just about impossible to get a decent photograph. So this is a line drawing. If you take a closer look, and here's some of the muskets, you can see the muskets that have been etched into the stone, and you can see the musket balls that are coming out in defense of the camp. There's another battle scene. This battle scene is different in that there's no horses and there's no guns. There Our warriors here, 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 and in the lower left center, they're carrying large shields, large buffalo shields. It would be very difficult to have a buffalo shield of this size if you were riding a horse. So these are referred to as pedestrian warriors. It's dated probably, they think, about 1400 to 1600 Common Era, which would be 14 to 1600 AD, using a different dating terminology. The inverted warriors here are likely dead warriors. And I don't know if they'd have been in the same tribe or a different one, but they've been interpreted as dead warriors. That would be pre-contact. Here's Lucy's rendition of Milk River at Writing on Stone. More drama. Cretaceous gold and the Lost Lemon gold mine, murder and madness. Up and down the Rocky Mountain foothills, from west to Calgary and Bragg Creek, south to the Montana border, are a series of ridges like this. And there's gold in the gravels in these ridges. There's cemented gravels, so we call them conglomerate. If you go to the Frank Slide Interpretive Center, drive into the parking lot and look up, walk up a little bit to the northeast, there's this ridge of conglomerate, cemented gravel. If you go for a hike around the Interpretive Center, the pathway takes you through right through the middle of this gravel. The story of the Lost Lemon gold mine is that there were two trappers, Blackjack and Lemon. They discovered gold somewhere in the Rocky Mountain foothills. Some people put it west of the Great Divide. Some people put it east of the Great Divide. They discovered the gold. One night around the campfire, they got into a fight and Blackjack killed Lemon. Quite literally, he gave him the axe. He became unstable after that, and then he wandered out of the foothills, went into Montana, down into the Tobacco Plains. He told his story there, got a lot of people excited, and for the next couple decades, very colorful characters having names like Lafayette French, King Bearspaw, John McDougall, and the Blackfoot woman, Cloudwalker. They searched in vain for the gold, for these gravels. They never found it. And it's said that there's also a curse that afflicts those who go looking for the gold. Tragic deaths, fires, storms, and serious illness was said to have afflicted those who were looking for the gold. However, those are all common day occurrences in the late 1800s. In the legend, the names Dutch Creek, Racehorse Creek, Highwood River, Gold Creek are all part of the legend. Also in some of the legends, the Old Man River. Up and down the Rocky Mountain foothills, I mentioned those ridges of gravel, of cemented gravel called a conglomerate. They define 8 old river channels, ancient river channels in the Rocky Mountain foothills that are about 90 to 100 million years old. They may be 20 kilometers wide, some are only a few kilometers wide. And we see them in the ridges all through the foothills. If you go look at the gravels that are in there, and the details don't matter except it's going to point to part of our story. There's a type of cobble, a type of pebble in there that's an igneous rock. There are other volcanic rocks. So where did they come from? They came from east central British Columbia, from this rock type that we call plutons. That's the rock type near the surface, east central British Columbia. The volcanic rocks came from eroded volcanoes, which would have been above these purple igneous plutons. But what's important for our story is all of these dots. These yellow gold dots are all gold occurrences in eastern British Columbia. Gold that was mined 1800s, early 1900s, and in some instances is still being mined. At that time, 90 to 100 million years ago, these were being eroded. The gold and the pebbles were being transported to these rivers 400 kilometers away and being deposited in what is now the Rocky Mountain foothills. If you go to one of those ridges and dig around behind it, don't do it in a park, please, or a provincial recreation area, and take some of that material down to the local river, put it in your gold pan, you can pan it, and you might get 5 to 20 grains of gold. They're not very big, but they're placer gold. They were carried by the river. Sometimes you might get a little bit of platinum as well. More drama. Let's change pace and let's go somewhere else. Let's go to Okotoks and look at the Okotoks erratic. South of Calgary, west of Okotoks, and northwest of Lethbridge. It's a very big stone. This is the largest of the stones we're going to talk about right now. Why is it there? During the last glaciation, when it was at its maximum, 21,000 to 18,000 years ago, there were two ice masses. There was those in the mountains, there was the Laurentide ice sheet in the east here. And what happened was there was a landslide on Mount Edith Cavell in Jasper National Park. The landslide put debris onto the glacier that was flowing in front of it. That glacier joined the Athabasca River Glacier, flowed out to Hinton, and met the massive Laurentide ice sheet, which was up to 3 or 4 kilometers thick. This ice from these valley glaciers was forced to flow in a southerly direction. And along its pathway, it left those giant boulders, such as we see in Okotoks, the Okotoks erratic. There is Mount Edith Cavell. It's a kilometer of this type of sandstone called the Gog quartzite. And it collapsed onto a glacier and flowed and made its way to Jasper onto Hinton. Here's a picture from the Alaska range. And you have a glacier, you have a landslide, you have mountains, you have a landslide, and that landslide went and dumped material on the glaciers, just like what we're suggesting here for the Okotoks erratic. So why is the Okotok erratic, or why is Okotok so broken up? Okotok is the Blackfoot word for rock. It means rock. It's got some other versions of that definition, but essentially it means rock. So how did it come to be? Blair First Rider, a Blackfoot elder, related this story about the formation, about the creation of Okotok. Nappy, who was creating the earth early in Earth's days, early in Earth's history, upset Okotok one day. Remember, Okotok is the rock before it got broken here. It had been an extremely hot day. Nappy was creating the earth. He gave his blanket. It was so hot he didn't need his blanket. He didn't want to carry it. He gave his blanket to Okotok. Later it got colder. Nappy wanted his back. He asked blanket back. He asked Okotok, could I have my blanket back? Nappy said no. Okotok said no. So Nappy took it, and that upset Okotok. Okotok started to chase Nappy. Nappy was worried Okotok was coming after him. He came across a bunch of bats. He asked them to help him to stop Okotok. So the bats said, yes, we will do that. They crashed into the big rock and they broke off pieces of it, which is what you see here. And to this day, bats now have flat faces. But he didn't stop Okotok, or that did not stop Okotok. So he kept running. He's being chased. He came across some nighthawks flying in the prairies there. He asked the nighthawks for help, and they agreed to help him. They blew gas on Okotok, and they eventually broke Okotok and stopped it. Blowing gas, you can do your own translation. So there's two interpretations how the Okotoks erratic came to be. More drama. Let's go to the Neutral Hills in east central Alberta. Northeast of Calgary, north of Lethbridge, southeast of Edmonton. Neutral Hills look like a series of foothills thrusts, but they're in the middle of the prairies, and you would say they shouldn't be there. So this is what they look like in a Google Earth image, and you can see these ridges. And they extend 70 kilometers across the prairies. They're up to 120 meters high, and they're so significant in the prairies that Captain John Palliser noted them during his mid-1800s expedition and put them on his map. This yellow dot, red center, is a great place to look at them. So why are they there? It's all to do with the glaciers. Glaciers pushed the underlying bedrock and thrust these ridges to create that landscape that we see. The glaciers advanced, they retreated, they advanced. When they would retreat, they would quite often leave a large block of ice. And then they would advance again and push the underlying bedrock in front of it to create these ridges that you see here. When these ice blocks melted, you were left with these depressions that you see in there. We call them kettle lakes, which is kind of a catchy name. If you want a nice little park to go visit Gooseberry Park, Provincial Park, right here on this kettle lake. And you'll know how the lake formed. You'll know how the ridges at the Neutral Hills formed. So the Neutral Hills were a territory to be shared by the Crow and the Blackfoot people. There was a lot of buffalo at the time. Berries there. If you go there now and over the next month, Saskatoon's choke cherries, strawberries. There's trees that grow in there in the middle of the prairie. So there's abundant firewood, and the hills give you protection from the wind in the winter. However, the Crow and the Blackfoot were at war. They would skirmish. They would make peace. It upset the Great Spirit that they were always fighting one another. So one night he put his finger down on the earth and he lifted up the hills. He lifted up the hills in through here. He left a passageway in between them. In the morning, when the Blackfoot and the Crow people woke up, they saw this new set of hills separating them. They walked to this entranceway, to this re-entrant in through here where the highway is, and they met each other, and then they made peace. And that is how the Neutral Hills got their name. Now that story is unattributed. It's in the literature, but we don't know where it originally came from. More drama. Let's go to Wally's Beach, not too far away from where you guys are, or those in Lethbridge are. A hike within a late Pleistocene landscape. Wally's Beach is on the St. Mary Reservoir, northeast of Cardston, southwest of McGrath, northeast of Waterton Lakes National Park. And it is a beautiful area. It's bleak, it's windy, you get sandblasted, but it is so beautiful and interesting to visit. The reservoir is just off in the distance. For what I want to tell you and show you right now, you have to go in late winter to early spring when the reservoir levels are low. If you go now, this whole area will be flooded. It will be a lake at which people are recreating. So there's Wally's Beach. And if you go there right now, the water may be this high, right up through here. So on Wally's Beach, what you see are mammoth tracks. That's what these are. These are mammoth tracks in a different type of sediment, in a muddier sediment. This is more sandy in through here. Woolly mammoth. They can be 30 to 50 centimeters across. 30 to 50 centimeters across. They found 500. The paleontologists and geologists and archaeologists have found 500 of these footprints. They found some small ones, which they believe are juveniles. They also find camel and horse footprints. Camels originated in North America, spread around the world, and then became extinct in North America about 13,000 years ago. The interesting thing is about 13,300 years ago, early North Americans were butchering camels and horses here. They found, the archaeologists, the geologists have found stone tools, and they found broken bones associated with those stone tools. They found proteins on some of the stone tools. So early man was butchering horses and camels here. They were likely butchering other animals, but we don't have evidence for that yet. Here are some of the bones and some of the tools. This picture shows how bleak and harsh I think it would have been when the hunters were looking for the camels, for the horses. They were probably hunting the woolly mammoths, but we don't have evidence for that here. There would have been glaciers in these valleys. From the glaciers, cold winds blew off, not very far away. The massive ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet, was several hundred kilometers to the north, and cold winds would have blown off it. It would have been harsh and cold, windy most of the time, and there were very few trees at the time. Here's Lucy's watercolor rendition of Wally's Beach. I think she's captured the bleakness of it there very nicely, and with the snow and the ice in the distant mountains. More drama. Dinosaurs perish. Meteor impacts and never-ending floods. let's go to Dry Island Buffalo Jump for that. The Red Deer River Valley, north of Three Hills, northeast of Three Hills in Trochu. Beautiful colors, beautiful stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is layers. So in Dry Island Buffalo Jump, in a ridge like this, but a little bit further to the east, they have found the fossils of Albertosaurus. Albertosaurus eventually evolved into, over the next couple million years, into Tyrannosaurus rex. They have found at Dry Island Buffalo Jump, in one bone bed, 26 specimens. And they dated those, meaning the animals have been dated as being 2 to 24 years in age. Because there are so many of them in that age range, the paleontologists, those who study the bones, suggest that Albertosaurus likely hunted in packs. And that would have been a very scary situation. The situation why those bones accumulated there, if you go to Africa, this is a herd of wildebeest trying to cross a river. Now, Albertosaurus was a carnivore, not like these herbivores that we see here. These are like moose, they eat plants and animals, but they would try to cross the river and then they'll drown. And it's the drowning probably happened to the Albertosaurus. And then the carcasses are scavenged here by buzzards. Here there's also hyenas coming in and all sorts of other, well, I'll say carnivores to eat the meat. The same thing happened with the Albertosaurus carcasses. In the area, just across the river to the east, they've also found an ornithomimus, which is a bird mimicking dinosaur. And it looks much like an ostrich, and it had feathers. And they've recovered some of the feathers. More drama dealing with the dinosaurs. 66.5 million years ago, a meteorite hit the Earth. That meteorite was probably 20 kilometers across, and it created a crater in the Yucatan Peninsula in the Caribbean that was 200 kilometers across. You can see evidence of that impact at Dry Island Buffalo Jump. You can't get up to it here, but it was right below where this coal seam is. This is too steep. You could get in there and dig around. It's a provincial park, so I don't recommend it. But 4 or 5 kilometers to the south along the riverbank, they found the same bed, and they found iridium, which only comes from outer space, and they found shocked quartz, a type of quartz grain that resulted from the impact. A meteor impact like that is probably the most devastating thing that can occur on Earth. Here's another picture, another rendition of what it could have looked like. And it hit the Earth, it hit the Yucatan Peninsula instantly. And I do mean instantly. Giant fires were created across North America. And then it became dark around much of the Earth from the ejected debris that was put up into the atmosphere and the soot from those fires. And nitric acid was created. There was nitric acid rain. Sulfuric acid aerosols blocked the sunlight from the Earth, and that cooled the Earth for a long period of time. And then, because of the extreme CO2 levels, carbon dioxide levels, from the vaporized limestones from when the meteor hit, we had immense, intense global warming. When the meteor hit, 76% of all species on Earth perished, gone. And an interesting little tidbit, side fact, is for about 10,000 years after the meteorite hit, the only plants, or not the only, the dominant plants on Earth were ferns. It took a long time for the other plants to evolve and to become eventually what we have today. The only way to describe it, it was a cataclysm. Scenic Geology of Alberta is about glaciers and volcanoes long past. Remember, Alberta was covered by ice as recently as 20,000 years ago. That ice was almost 4 kilometers thick, 3,800 meters here, thinning southwards. If you draw a line from north from the territories south to Montana, you can see, let's go back. Lethbridge, the ice would have been 1.5 to 2 kilometers thick. So when you leave, or when you're finished with this presentation, go outside, look up, and think about 2 kilometers of ice above you. If you do draw a line from north to south, what you see is that ice sheet. Northwest Territories here, Montana border here, up to 3 kilometers thick, thinning southwards. Notice the topography of Alberta. It rises from south to north by almost 1 kilometer. This ice effectively flowed uphill as it advanced across the province. Details of this figure don't matter too much, but I want you to remember or think about how many times in the last 3 million years your city has been glaciated. Calgary was glaciated once only. Lethbridge would have been glaciated once. Edmonton, on the other hand, was glaciated twice. This is over the last 3 million years from not very much data, because there isn't much data. It's just kind of an interesting little sidelight about our glaciations. The last glaciation was at its maximum about 20,000 years ago. It covered all of Alberta, except for the Cypress Hills, the Porcupine Hills, and a few places along the Rocky Mountains. There were 2 ice sheets, that which came from the mountains and that which came from northern Canada, Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet. And then the ice started to melt. Just remember this, because I'm going to talk a little bit about Calgary here and the lakes that were here. The ice melted and it's leaving Alberta. By 10,300 years ago, the ice was gone. 4 kilometers of ice would have done a lot of erosion and created a lot of beautiful landscape. When that ice melted, the same thing. In the Calgary area, and the same type of thing happens around Lethbridge. We had very large glacial lakes. This is Nose Hill, the north side of Calgary, and here's some of those erratics that came from Mount Edith Cavell. And if you go to one of the communities in North Calgary and you take a panoramic shot and you look across the river valley, Nose Hill, downtown Calgary, River Valley on the other, in through here, Signal Hill, Rocky Mountains in the distance. And then put the ice in there. There were 2 ice masses, the Laurentide ice sheet and the Bow River ice sheet, that which came from the mountains down the Bow River. When the ice started to melt, there was a lot of water and it filled the river valley. It filled the river valley to such an extent that Glacial Lake Calgary extended up to the south side of Nose Hill. The university, where the library is, there was probably under 40 meters of water. It was a very big lake. All of downtown Calgary and all of the river valley would have been inundated by that lake. So the first ice that came into the Calgary area, again, 20-odd thousand years ago, maybe a little bit longer, came from the west. And then we had the Laurentide ice sheet. Details don't matter, but I just want to show you the lakes. Those lakes formed all over Alberta, and they kept changing style and dimensions. You see sediments like this, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, all across Calgary, glacial lake sediments, great places to build houses on and to put fences in, as opposed to gravels and boulders. We'll leave that one. Let's go north to Elk Island National Park and look at it. We're talking about glaciers long past. This is all wetlands. Low-lying hills, shallow lakes, and all these abundant wetlands. It's beaver country. The beavers love it. Their buffaloes are in through there too. So in Elk Island National Park, or around Elk Island National Park, this area was all covered by ice. There were what we call ice streams that flowed on either side of Elk Island National Park. Ice streams probably flowed along at 100 to 200 meters, 300 meters per year. That was fast for a glacier. And I did say hundreds of meters per year. But those ice streams didn't flow up and over where Elk Island National Park is. So those ice streams flowed around Elk Island National Park, which is here. This was a subtle highland. And when the ice melted, a giant block of ice was left here, and it just rotted in place. It rotted with all of its debris to give you the landscape that we see Elk Island National Park, Cooking Lake, east of Edmonton. It gives you this topography, this terrain. And you see terrain like this all across the prairies, formed by similar processes. Geologists come up with all sorts of names. The details don't matter, but they're descriptive. Prairie mounds, there's a mound. Rimmed ridges, ice-walled lake plains, prairie donuts. You can picture what the topography looks like. Let's go west of Lethbridge now. Let's go to the Crow's Nest Pass. And just west of Coleman, we're going to look at the Crow's Nest Volcanics. There's this ridge of mountains. Iron Ridge is right here. They extend north along the foothills. About 103 million years ago, these rocks, which are volcanics, were deposited. And that's what you see from where this dot is right here on the south side of the road. What that is all about is there was a large explosive volcano. And in that volcano, there were bombs, ejecta, shot out from the top of it. The largest I've ever seen is the size of a small SUV. There were debris flows, just lava flows coming down. There were extremely hot flows that came down the side of the volcano called nuées ardentes. And they had temperatures of perhaps 1,000 degrees centigrade. And they instantly charred trees that were growing on the side of the mountain, or the volcano. And we see that. Those volcano deposits were about 300 meters thick. But the thing I want you to remember, what you see at Coleman, or just west of Coleman, that volcano was put in place where Cranbrook is now, 90 kilometers west of Coleman. And then it was deeply buried. The mountain building pushed that volcanic pile northeast about 90 kilometers to where you see it in Coleman. I think that's pretty interesting. We see volcanic ash from this volcano as far north as Edmonton. And that was 103 million years ago. In those volcanic rocks, you see these 1 to 3 to 4 millimeter features in here, and they're garnets. They're a melanite garnet. They're low temperature, low pressure. So yes, you can go get a handful of them, but they're not very valuable. More volcanoes long past. Let's go to Dorothy on the Red Deer River Valley. Behind this particular church is a volcanic ash layer. A volcano spewed ash into the atmosphere. And it was deposited all along the Red Deer River Valley. It created a plume of ash that was deposited into a layer that was up to 13 meters thick. It would have been dark below where that ash was. And it gives us that spectacular, thick, very light gray layer all along the river valley. Volcanoes long past. Let's go to northern Alberta, the Buffalo Head Hills. Now, I don't take people there, but this is an imagine exercise in the book. I take you to Sagittawa Lookout on the Peace River, and I say, just imagine about 150 kilometers to the northeast, the Buffalo Head Hills. There were some volcanoes there that took place 60 to 88 million years ago. So a long time ago again, and the important thing about them is they brought diamonds to the surface. 1 to 2 carat diamonds were brought to the surface. I worked on those diamonds, or I worked on these deposits a long time ago. We went to Vancouver. We went to the mining company, Ashton's office. They opened the vaults and they took out a handful of diamonds for us to look at and even to run our fingers over top just to feel them. It was quite an experience. The Scenic Geology of Alberta is about when banks fail. So for that, we're going to go to Edmonton and we're going to look at the lake plain of Edmonton. Like Calgary, Edmonton is built on a glacial lake. And then the glacier melted, the land lifted up, and a deep valley was cut. And that's what we're going to talk about, the effects of that deep valley. And at the time, there was ice all around Edmonton. The ice was starting to melt. It was starting to rot. Water was flowing off that. The ice was on three sides, and it created this large glacial lake. Then the lake started to drain. It started to flow initially southwards towards the airport, and then that channel became abandoned, and then the lake started to drain northwards, and it cut the more modern-day North Saskatchewan River Valley. What you see when you go to one of the little parks in Edmonton and you look across on the horizon, it's just flat, flat, flat. Whenever you drive across the plains of Alberta and you see really flat surfaces, there's a very strong chance you're driving across an old lake bottom, a glacial lake bottom. And I said the landscape lifted up after the ice melted. It cut these deep valleys, the Edmonton River Valley. The nature of a river is it erodes on one side and then it deposits on the other side. Erodes here, deposits here, deposits here, and erodes here. So that erosion creates these very steep cliffs. It deposits here, it creates steep cliffs, and you get bank failures. You get slumps. That's what you have shown here. The North Saskatchewan River is undercutting this steep bank, and this bank is failing downwards into the river. Volcanic ash layers, again, I mentioned those. They're very important because when they get wet, they're very slippery, and that helps these banks to fail. There is one of those volcanic ash layers, a fairly thin one. So go to the end of the world. The Edmontonians call Keeler Point the end of the world. And it's on one of these erosional cut banks. And what you see is a block that failed in 1989. It failed again in 2002. And the old Keeler Road used to be in through here. It's gone. It's failed. The banks of the river have failed and the road is gone now. The city put these pylons in trying to protect the road. It didn't work. So they made it into a nice little park to go visit. Another one in Edmonton, which I think is pretty neat. City of Edmonton, downtown core, the central business district is right here. Right beside it is a giant landslide, but they know that it's there. They don't build on it. 1900, this landslide started to form. 1910, it had failed and collapsed down into the river valley. The city filled the hole with displaced material and other rubble. It's continued to slip and slide away today. Now the city tries to protect that area. They put erosional riprap, large boulders to prevent erosion here. The buildings on the park are movement tolerant. They can take a little bit of displacement. And if displacement occurs, if more failure occurs, it's a park. It isn't as expensive as the chateau and the convention center failing. So the engineers have done their job here. This has got nothing to do with bank failure, but the American lion, Panthera atrox, lived here before and after the last ice age. And he was just such a massive and impressive cat. And he was a carnivore. He was looking, if you'd have been here at the time, you'd have been a meal. When banks fail, Peace River, Northern Alberta. And here we are at the town of Peace River, Smoky River in the distance, and everywhere where I've put an S is a slump or a bank failure. The bank is constantly failing and slipping down into the rivers. The city of Peace River, the town of Peace River, is built on a resistant sandstone ledge, so it's somewhat protected, but there's bank failure all the way along through here. And very similar to the Edmonton situation. Glacial deposits or older Cretaceous deposits are those that fail. When banks fail, Crow's Nest Pass, when it shook violently, it's not really a bank failure, but I'll put it into this category for discussion purposes. So now we're straight west of Lethbridge in the Crow's Nest Pass, Frank Slide and Turtle Mountain here. And it's just such an impressive slide. 1903, late April, and it was Canada's largest landslide. The railroad and the river were blocked. It took 2 years to get the highway cleared of rubble. The railroad put hundreds of men to work, and they had it cleared within about 30 days. Quite an interesting story. Public versus private. Half the town of Frank was destroyed, and at least 90 people died in that landslide. Why did the landslide occur? It occurred all because of geological processes. The rocks have been folded. They've been bent. If you take rocks like this and bend them, you create lines of weakness, creating failure. And then mountain building took place and pushed these mountains to their present position. There's been multiple glaciations, and that's just oversteepened the slope. And then some people suggest that the coal mines that were being mined at the time contributed to the landslide that took place. The Alberta government has monitoring instruments on the top of the mountain, and blocks are widening and blocks are down dropping. There will likely be another landslide in the future, not necessarily of this size, but it's likely to happen. The landslide debris came down across the valley and up, and that's the operative word, up the opposite slope. So the Scenic Geology of Alberta is a story of unbridled power, drama, glaciers and volcanoes long past, and when banks fail. That's what we've talked about. You can put our beautiful landscapes into these types of scenarios. That's what I talk about in the book again, The Scenic Geology of Alberta. I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And I would also like to thank the Canadian Geological Foundation, who gave me a grant to publish the book. I would also like to thank Analog Books and encourage you to go into the bookstore, support your local bookseller. If you're not in Lethbridge, most of the bookstores in in the province carry the book. I'd also like to acknowledge Gather and Graze, who donated our charcuterie plate for the contest we had running in conjunction with this presentation hosted by Analog Books. So thank you very much.